The 17-year-old Gukesh Damaraju clinched victory in the 2024 FIDE Candidates after drawing his final round game against Hikaru Nakamura. Meanwhile, his two main rivals, Caruana and Nepomniachtchi, could only draw their game despite Caruana missing many winning chances. This means Gukesh will now qualify for the upcoming World Championship match to take place later this year against the current FIDE World Champion Ding Liren. Now going into today's round, Gukesh led the field with 8.5 points, with Nakamura, Nepomniachtchi, and Caruana all trailing by a half point with 8. Naka had white against Gukesh in today's final round and pushed hard for the win, but Gukesh was ultimately too solid as it ended up only black playing for 2 results in the end, and that game would eventually be drawn. This would allow either Caruana or Nepomniachtchi to catch up to Gukesh and force a playoff tiebreak with a win. And this game was incredibly dramatic, with Caruana on the verge of winning, but ultimately faltering and missing a number of winning lines. So that game was eventually drawn, allowing Gukesh to keep the sole lead and clinch tournament victory with a final score of 9 out of 14. Meanwhile, in the women's candidates, Tan Zhongyi secured victory in the tournament after a draw with black against Anna Muzychuk. This brought her to 9 out of 14 points, leaving her main rival Lei Tingzhe out of contention. Lei would go all out to try and win against Katarina Logno, but ended up losing her game regardless. Jumping into today's games, we'll start with the game between Nakamura and Gukesh, with Nakamura in a must-win position if he were to try and win this tournament, as he was a half point behind Gukesh. In this one, Gukesh went for the Queen's Gambit accepted, definitely a solid choice, and goes for this rather unusual line with bishop to e7. Normally the main move is a6 or c5, but soon we do get a very typical QGA type of position. Here after the move a6, b5, bishop a2, c takes d4 is played, and Naka spends some time here but does eventually recapture with the pawn. Perhaps the move rook to d1 here was better and would have maybe given white some advantage, because in the game after e takes d4, Gukesh plays this one very precisely with the move b4. The point here is that if white takes this pawn, black is actually going to play knight to c6, not taking the pawn with the bishop, but rather looking to take the pawn with the knight. And it seems like once black gets this in, the knight can come back to the blockading square on d5, and black should be all right here, though the position would remain roughly equal. Instead, Naka chose knight to e4, and this is one reason why rook to d1 maybe was more accurate here. If black were to go b4 in this position, this wouldn't work as well. White can take, and after knight c6, knight takes d4. White is definitely doing better here. It's not clear that black is going to win back the pawn. So after ed b4, Naka goes for knight e4, but now b takes a3, another very precise move from Gukesh, bishop to b7, and essentially black is an absolutely comfortable version of this structure, with white having this isolated queen pawn and that being a long-term weakness. Naka goes for knight c3 here, trying to avoid the trade of pieces, but black's position is very, very comfortable. After knight d5, bishop to d2, Gukesh trades the knights off anyway, knight to d7, and at this point it's really only black that can be better. Gukesh might have had a chance here maybe with a5 to get some kind of advantage with the threat of bishop a6, although the game does remain, I think, close to equal here. Said rook c8 was the continuation, knight f6, very, very solid play from both sides. And now Gukesh takes on f3 and does grab this pawn on d4. Naka gets some compensation here with the two bishops and is a little bit worse, but still within the range of equality. That said though, bishop c5, bishop to e1, a5, queen to b5, this was a key moment here with Gukesh looking over at the other game quite a bit between Fabiano and Nepomniachtchi, seeing what's going on there. He ends up trading queens, which takes us down to basically a close to drawn endgame. Perhaps he could have kept winning chances alive with queen to f4, but of course his decision queen b5 is very reasonable. Black is up a pawn here, but this one is super hard to win as white has the bishop pair, and yeah, it's going to be very, very difficult for black to make use of the extra pawn. Eventually, after some trades, Gukesh goes knight to b4, and this is essentially a draw offer, as Naka could have first traded rooks here and also traded on b4, leading to an opposite color bishop endgame, which would be an easy draw. But Naka, having to play for a win, keeps the pieces on the board. But that said, he really can't do much here, And Gukesh plays this one very, very solidly, and the eval doesn't really change of this game. Eventually we get this endgame with opposite color bishops and rooks on the board, and black is maybe a tiny bit better here because he's more active, but objectively the game is drawn. And yeah, after further play by both sides, they end up trading all the pawns off, and this one is eventually drawn. I'll take you folks to the final position here as Naka runs his a-pawn up the board. Black still has this e-pawn, but can't do much with it. And eventually we get a funny sequence where Naka actually gives up his bishop, but does manage to promote the a-pawn here after rook f8 check, a8 equals queen. Gukesh has to give his rook. White is up in exchange, but is never winning this position with the bishop and pawn. Even without the pawn, black would have an easy draw here with the rook versus bishop. And this one didn't last long. Naka just goes for rook e4 and immediately forces the draw with just bare kings left on the board. So this would mean that the game between Caruana and Nepomniachtchi would be quite critical here, as the winner of this game could catch up to Gukesh and force a playoff tiebreak. And this one was very sharp, with Nepo going for this hybrid Rogozin-Nimzo-Indian line with early bishop to b4. It seemed like Nepo was actually the better prepared player in this one, as it was Caruana who started spending more time in the opening. But the position got extremely complicated very, very quickly here. All this is quite normal, a very, very sharp and aggressive line from black to play h5, but basically this forces f3, and we get this structure where black has the two bishops, but white has some central play here with f4 and both e4 coming in the position. Here Fabi does go for f4, bishop g4, knight to f3. Now first the engine was saying that black should take on f4 here, then after g takes f4, take on f3. This position, of course, very, very complicated, but seems like it's close to equal. Queen a5 is the engine suggestion. But Nepo goes for queen e7, which probably lands him in some trouble, because now Caruana goes e4, and he is ready to open up the e-file. He wants to bring a rook here, and it's very, very dangerous for black's position. Note that it's hard for black to castle queenside without hanging the pawn on d5, with knight takes d5 due to the pin on the c-file. So Nepo decides to take on c3 here, but now queen takes c3. If black takes on e4, white can just take this one back with the bishop, and black can't take because of rook to e1. So Nepo instead takes on f3 and now takes on e4. And here fe4 definitely give white a good position, but Caruana takes with the bishop, as his bishop is very, very strong, and he looks to play d5 to open up all of his pieces. Now this position is looking very, very difficult for black. For example, if castle's queenside, then d5. White is doing extremely well here. dc6 is just a huge threat, and white's bishop, of course, a very strong piece. And Nepo does find the best chance here with g takes f4, g4 from Fabi looking to play on the h-file. Now black castles, but now d5 is a problem once again. Black had to go, I think, h4 here to keep the advantage somewhat minimal, but white is still doing very, very well here. For example, rook e1, king to b1, and so on. And yeah, white is definitely better. So the game sees castles d5, and now Nepo goes for h4 in this position, allowing dc6 but playing knight to c5, looking for some kind of blockade on the dark squares after cb and king to b8. White definitely has a big advantage here, but Caruana actually finds an even better continuation. He gives check, goes king to b1, and his point is he wants to keep things open. If b takes c6, then white has queen to b4 check, followed by rook to c1, and black has issues defending the knight on c5. Rook d5 will soon run into bishop e4, for example. King a8, rook to c1 here, rook d5, bishop to e4, and black is losing as just too many targets in the position, and yeah, just losing a ton of material here. So instead, Nepo goes for b6, but this keeps the c-pawn alive, and here Caruana finds a fantastic shot, rook to d7. The main point is that if knight takes d7, he has c7 check, and here white wins back the rook immediately. And after something like bishop to e4, black's king here is actually just way too weak. We have queen c6 coming, as well as the rook coming in, and white just has a decisive attack right here. So instead we see rook takes d7, white just recaptures, rook to d8, queen to d4, and black can win this d-pawn, but the problem is white's pieces are just way too active here, and Caruana sets up a very deadly pin on the d-file. Next he's going to take on f4 with check, and white's pieces are just dominating their counterparts. But Nepo continues fighting here quite a bit. as this position is winning for white, but a little bit tricky with this h-pawn, bishop to e4. At this point, they're around move 30, and Caruana under 10 minutes. Nepo having a bit more time, but time pressure definitely played a very serious factor in this round. a5 from Nepo, probably the only chance to defend against this queen d5, bishop e4 battery, but this allows Fabi to snag the pawn on f7, and white now has these two passers and is completely winning here. But h2, this pawn gets to h2, queen h7, and now king to b8, and at this point, the time pressure really sets in. We see a3 from Fabi, definitely a good move, queen to e5, queen h6, now threatening queen c6, forcing the queen back. And here, Caruana goes for g5. This is still winning, maybe a little bit unnecessary. For example, white could play rook to d2 here, followed by taking on h2, and basically just getting rid of this pawn, and white should be winning in the end. What Fabi did is also winning, but it gets a little complicated. After g5, rook g8 is played. He now goes rook to h1, knight to c5, and bishop h7. Bishop c2 probably would have kept a bigger advantage here for white, and then he's ready to go g6 and just take this pawn on h2 and eventually just get a completely winning endgame. But in the game we see bishop h7, which gives Nepo a clear chance here. He takes on g5, sacrificing the exchange, but getting some play against white's king here after queen takes h7 check. Now this is move 41, so they've made the time control and gotten an extra 30 minutes. But here Caruana makes a critical blunder, this move king to a1. He basically had a choice here between king a2 and king a1. He ends up choosing wrong. This position ends up being very, very difficult for both players to play. It's very computery and tons of tactics. But the main point is that after king a1, he allows black to play queen to c2 here. And the key idea is that this knight to b3 move is coming with check. So had white played king to a2, for example, then after queen to c2, the difference is queen f4 check. White can take on h2, and note that knight b3 is not coming with check. In that case, king a2 would be played, then knight to c1, black would have a perpetual and is making the draw. But in this position, there's no perpetual, hence white is winning. So that would have once again given Caruana another chance to win the game. After king a1, queen c2, all of a sudden things get extremely sharp. He does manage to keep winning chances alive to Caruana's credit with queen g8 check and king a2. Black pushes a4, securing the b3 square, and now f4. Now Nepo messes up, doesn't find the only move, king a6. Very difficult move to find. Again, tons of computer tactics in this position. He plays the immediate knight to b3, which gives Fabi another winning chance here after queen g7, queen c3. Fabi finds a very, very precise sequence here. Queen c4 check, rook to e1. If black promotes on h1, then white is coming in with rook to e7, and there's a forced mate here, just a couple of moves, with the queen coming in to c7, for example. So after rook e1, knight to c5, queen f1, once again, very, very precise play from Caruana here. He finds all the right moves, but the game continues to be super, super complicated as Nepo still tries to create chances. At this point, he doesn't really have a ton of winning chances unless Fabi blunders. Keep in mind, Nepo is also playing for the win to force the tiebreak, but it is trying to at least save the game and not lose it. So next critical moment comes here after queen e6. Fabi comes in with rook to c7 check. The Indians don't like this move. After f7, black had another, almost the miracle draw here with knight to d2 check. The point being after king c2, queen f5 check, black can actually sacrifice the knight and give a perpetual here. Good luck calculating this. The point is not that black is going to take the rook because then white gets a second queen, but rather black is just going to keep giving checks here. Apparently white's king has nowhere to hide, and you can never really block with the queen at any moment because then black will just trade and promote on h1, for example. So this was a miracle draw. Nepo actually ends up missing it, gives queen f5 check, king a2, now knight to c5. And at this point, Fabi has another chance to win this one, but he had to find queen a8 check here. They repeat a couple times, king a6, and then queen to e2. All this is super, super difficult once again. He repeats a couple times here with queen a8, queen to c6, eventually goes rook to e7, but now queen f1, and black is saving the game once again. This game just had so many ups and downs for both players. He's threatening ideas like queen c4 check as well as just promoting. Now Fabi repeats a couple times once again, and then finds the only chance in the position to keep the game alive, rook to e4. The point is that if black promotes, white is threatening queen a8 check, followed by rook to b4 with a surprising mate. Nepo, of course, did not blunder that one, but he finds the only defense. Knight takes e4. And after takes, queen takes check. Both sides get their second queen here, and this results in a second queen endgame, with white having 2 versus 1 on the queen side. But objectively, this is very, very drawish. Even if black didn't have the b pawn, a lot of those endgames are drawn as well. But here with just 2 versus 1, black's king in good position, it's just really, really difficult to create any winning chances here with white. Caruana definitely, obviously tried for quite some time here, but eventually he does give up as he's just unable to make progress. Black's queen just having too many checks, and Nepo defending this one very, very precisely. So a couple more moves were made here, but after queen d4, king to b3, move 109, Caruana finally offers the draw, and of course Nepo agreed. With that, both players lost their chance to catch up to Gukesh, who at this exact moment did manage to secure the candidate's victory. Moving on to the other 2 games in the round, of course, these weren't important from a competitive standpoint, but did have to be played out. The game between Firouzja and Vidit was basically a non-game. We saw this very common Berlin draw that the players often go for, as obviously the players just wanted to end their final round with a draw. So this one was drawn quickly, but we did see quite a serious fight in the game between Abasov and Pragnananda, with Pragg playing the only King's Indian defense in the event, looking to play this one for a win. This game was quite interesting. It was a Fianchetto King's Indian, and for the most part, white had a small advantage here going into the middle game, but eventually Pragg does manage to equalize and even starts playing for a win later on in the endgame. I believe Abasov's key mistake here is he plays bishop to c3 and he allows a trade of bishops. And here, instead of queen c3, goes for the rather paradoxical b takes c3, which unfortunately just leaves white with long-term weaknesses. His idea was to keep the rook open, but in the end, Pragg manages to break through on the queen side. As we'll see, first a couple of rooks here get traded off. Queen d7, rook b1, and the key moment comes here after queen e1. Pragg goes for this endgame, plays b5, and manages to basically get a decisive advantage here, as white's pawns are weak and the bishop on c6 is really not good. And black here just goes for the d pawn, rook c2, and eventually rook to the d file. We'll see here after c4, rook to d1, and now he's just winning this pawn by force. Rook d3 check, takes on d5. Abasov goes for the rook endgame, but this one ends up being lost. And after check and check here, king e4, rook h3, white resigned at this moment as he's losing another pawn, and the resulting endgame is just over. Had white kept the king here on the king side, it was also bad, because rook d3 check, king g2, black can play d5 followed by d4, and yeah, white is just losing this with the rook on a3, pawn on c3. So with that, Pragg did manage to end his tournament on a high note with a victory. Finally, moving on to the key game in the women's candidates, this was Tan Zhongyi's black game against Anna Muzychuk. Once again, the tournament situation here was that Tan needed to at least draw this game to secure tournament victory. This opening was rather sharp, with her going for this O'Kelly line with a6, and we get this quick tactic in the opening, bishop takes f5. Followed by knight to d4, and black has sacrificed a pawn but is looking to win it back. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop e7 here, castles, castles. Eventually black does manage to trade on, takes on d5, take on g5, and we get this middle game with opposite color bishops, which should be close to equal here, f4, bishop f6. Queen to d3, this move ends up giving black an advantage. Better was fg to start. After queen d3, black takes on f5, forcing white to trade on f6 here, bishop takes b7, but now black gets e4 in, and at this point, black is much, much better, in fact, close to winning according to the engines. The knight on d4 is strong, pawn on e4 is strong as well, and for the most part, Tan controlled this game. In fact, she did quite well to almost win the game, but eventually here, she basically just shuts it down and allows a draw with queen to c3, white gives a check, rook to e4, h3, and now after queen to d2, she allows her opponent to give her a perpetual. White has nothing better because the e-pawn is too strong. And of course, given the tournament situation, it seems like Tan didn't mind a draw here either, as this allowed her to clinch victory in the women's candidates. And now Tan Zhongyi will qualify for the upcoming Women's World Championship match against her fellow compatriot, Grandmaster Zhu Wenjun. So folks, that wraps up the 2024 FIDE Candidates. It's been an absolute thrill to follow this event. Super, super exciting and dramatic throughout. And I hope you enjoyed the recaps as much as I did recording them. Until next time, take care.